Confusion quickly curdled into rage. He was the son of the most powerful man in Rome. Rejection was a language he did not speak. For a child, a female to deny him was not just a refusal, it was heresy against his ego. The arch desire remained, but now it was poisoned by a need to destroy what he could not possess. A 12-year-old girl had bruised his ego. He returned home, falling into a sickness of the mind. Lying in bed, he groaned and refused food, acting like a spoiled child denied a possession. But this toy was a human being. His father, Sempronius, saw this. He asked what was wrong. The son confessed. He wanted the girl, Agnes. She had refused him. She had insulted him. Sempronius, a powerful man who loved and indulged his son, decided to intervene. He believed it was a simple misunderstanding. He believed the girl was just playing games, or perhaps her parents were holding out for a higher price. He went to Agnes's house. He spoke to her parents. He used his rank. He used his influence. He demanded the marriage. Agnes came forward. She stood before the Prefect of Rome. She was small. He was a giant of authority. She repeated her refusal. She did not use soft words. She did not apologize. She said, "I will have no other spouse than him who chose me first." Sempronius was stunned. This was not just rejection. This was rebellion. In Rome, the father's word was law. The prefect's word was absolute. For a child to stand firm against both was unheard of. He looked at her closely. He saw something in her eyes. It was not fear. It was not greed. It was a strange fire. He realized then she was not just stubborn. She was a Christian. The atmosphere in the room changed. The air grew cold. The mask of civility dropped. Sempronius was no longer a concerned father attempting to secure a bride for his son. He was the judge. He was the executioner. He was the living embodiment of the Roman state. Roman law forbade the execution of a purity. It was supposed to be an act of mercy. But in AD 304, the Prefect of Rome found a savage loophole. He reasoned, if the law protects Agnes's purity, then nullify that integrity first. A 12-year-old child was sentenced to a house of shame, not to punish her crime, but to enable her execution. Sentenced to a place of infamy and exposed to the cruelty of men, she faced a fate far worse than death. But the men who entered that room expecting a victim found something terrifying instead. To understand how a noble daughter of Rome ended up in such a hellish nightmare, we must rewind the clock to a time before the chains and the shame. This tragedy did not begin in the place of ill repute. It began in the marble corridors of high society. Agnes was a daughter of privilege. To the outside world, her family was the picture of Roman success, yet they harbored a treasonous truth. They were Christians. They lived in secret. They knew the danger. The edict of Diocletian was in effect. Christians were enemies of the state. They were hunted. They were tortured. They were killed in the arenas for sport. Agnes knew this. She saw the smoke rising from the sacrifices. She smelled the fear in the streets. She understood the cost of her faith. She accepted it. She made a vow, a secret promise to God. She would belong to no man. She would remain pure. This vow was her shield. It was also her target. The prefect Sempronius ruled the city. He was the law. He held the power of life and death. He had a son. This son was young. He was arrogant. He was accustomed to taking what he wanted. He saw Agnes. He did not see a person. He did not see a spiritual being. He saw a prize. He saw an innocent life that he wanted to control. The obsession began. It started with looks. He watched her in the streets. He watched her from the shadows. His stare was invasive, the kind that makes you want to disappear. Agnes felt it. Every girl knows that look. His stare was a threat. It signaled clear intent. He would claim her. The son of the prefect approached her parents. He brought gifts, jewels, gold, silks from the east, expensive trinkets meant to buy a child. He thought it was a transaction. He thought he was generous. He offered marriage. In Roman law, a girl of 12 could marry. It was legal. It was normal. But for Agnes, it was a sentence. Marriage meant submission. It meant breaking her vow. It meant surrendering her spirit to a pagan who saw her as property. He came to her. He showed her the jewels. He smiled. It was a smile of ownership. He expected gratitude. Instead, he met resistance. She looked at the gold. She looked at him. She did not smile. She did not lower her eyes. She spoke. Her voice was steady. She told him to leave. She told him his gifts were dust. She told him she was already spoken for. She said her lover was greater than any Roman. She was speaking of God. The son of the prefect stood frozen. He knew the laws. He knew the edicts of Diocletian by heart. These edicts were not suggestions. They were absolute mandates designed to purge the empire of subversive elements. Being a Christian was not merely a difference in religious opinion. It was treason. It was a crime punishable by death. Agnes had just exposed herself. By rejecting the gods of Rome and declaring loyalty to a different king, she had handed him the weapon to destroy her. But Sempronius had a crueler idea. Death was too easy. Death was final. In the Roman worldview, executing a martyr often had the unintended consequence of strengthening their cause. He did not want to make her a hero. He wanted to break her. He wanted to crush that strange, unnerving fire in her eyes that challenged his authority. He looked at his son's desire, which had twisted from infatuation into a demand for possession. He looked at the girl's purity, which stood as a silent rebuke to the decadence of his class. A plan formed in his mind. It was a plan devoid of humanity. Sempronius devised a cruel plan. He would destroy her reputation before taking her life. He spoke to her. His voice was low. It was a growl. He gave her a choice, a false choice. It was a standard interrogation tactic. Offer a terrifying path and a slightly less terrifying path, both leading to the state's desired outcome. He told her she could marry his son. She could enjoy wealth, protection, and the status of a Roman matron. Or she could serve the goddess Vesta. The Vestal virgins were honored women in Rome, keepers of the sacred flame. But they served pagan gods. To a devout Christian, tending the fire of Vesta was an act of idolatry, a spiritual death. Agnes shook her head. Her refusal was immediate. She would not bow to idols. She would not marry a pagan. Sempronius smiled. It was a wolf's smile. He had anticipated this refusal. He told her there was a third option. He reminded her of the law. Roman law was specific and rigid. It protected virgins from execution. The superstition held that killing a virgin brought bad luck to the city. Therefore, they could not be put to death while pure. Agnes stood tall. She thought this law would save her. She believed her physical integrity provided a legal shield. She was wrong. Sempronius twisted the law. He turned the shield into a sword. The state had a solution for virgins who needed to die. They simply removed the virginity first. If you will not be a bride, he said, then you will be a whore. The word hung in the air. It was heavy. It was filthy. Agnes froze. The threat was not death. The threat was violation. Sempronius declared his sentence with the sterile detachment of a bureaucrat, stamping a document. If she refused the marriage, she would be stripped of her rights as a noblewoman. The state would seize her. They threatened to send her to a place of shame, to break her will and purity. And so would every other man in Rome, with a coin in his pocket. The prefect was effectively sentencing a child to total moral destruction under the guise of legal punishment. This was the terror. This was the true face of the empire. It used physical violation as a weapon of war. It used degradation as a tool of compliance against conquered territories and internal dissidents alike. They targeted the one thing Agnes valued most, her integrity. Her body was the temple of her God. They planned to desecrate the temple. They wanted to force God out of her by corrupting the very vessel of her faith. It was psychological warfare. They believed that if they corrupted her body, her God would abandon her and her spirit would shatter. Agnes looked at the powerful men. She saw their lust. She saw their cruelty. She felt the cold stone of the floor beneath her feet. At 12, she faced the empire alone. There were no lawyers to argue her case. There were no appeals. The machinery of the state was grinding into gear. The order was given. Soldiers stepped forward. Rough hands grabbed her arms. The metal of their armor was cold against her skin. They dragged her toward the door. She did not scream. She did not beg. Panic rose in her chest, sharp and biting. It is a primal instinct to fear pain and violation, but she pushed it down. She held on to her vow. The journey to her prison began. The streets were crowded. People watched. Some jeered, caught up in the excitement of a high-profile arrest. Some looked away in shame, recognizing the brutality of dragging a noble daughter to a brothel. The soldiers marched. Agnes walked. She walked toward a hell designed specifically for her. The predators were waiting. The trap was sprung. The streets of Rome were loud. Dust rose from the cobblestones. The sun beat down, harsh and unforgiving. Agnes walked between the guards. Her wrists were bruised from the grip of the soldiers. Her small feet stumbled on the uneven stones. The crowd parted. Eyes followed her. Some were curious. Some were cruel. They whispered, "The Christian girl, the one who refused the prefect." Rumors moved faster than the procession. They knew where she was going. The destination was infamous. It was a place where bodies were sold, a place where souls were extinguished. The Circus Agonalis was known for its dark archways and the illicit trades that happened beneath them. The lupanar stood in the shadow of the great arches. It was a stain on the city. The air around it smelled of stale wine, sweat, and unwashed bodies. Laughter drifted from inside, coarse and hollow. Agnes stopped at the entrance. The darkness of the doorway seemed to breathe. It was a mouth waiting to swallow her. The soldiers pushed her forward. She resisted, digging her heels into the dirt. It was the instinct of survival. No child walks willingly into a fire. For a moment, the procession stalled. The contrast was stark. The armed might of the Praetorian Guard struggling to push a small girl into a room. Inside, the light was dim. Oil lamps sputtered on the walls, casting a greasy yellow light. The shadows were long and distorted. Men sat on benches. They drank cheap wine. They gambled with dice. They looked up as the soldiers entered. Silence fell. It was a heavy, suffocating silence. All eyes turned to Agnes. The air grew thick with tension. It was the tension of a pack of dogs spotting a wounded bird. These were men of the lower rung, laborers, off-duty soldiers, drifters, and they were suddenly presented with a prize usually reserved for the aristocracy. The captain of the guard stepped forward. He announced the sentence. He spoke loudly so all could hear. "This girl is a Christian. She refuses the gods. She refuses marriage. The prefect has decreed she is no longer free. She belongs to the public. Do with her as you please." A murmur ran through the room. Men licked their lips. They stood up. They moved closer. The circle tightened. Agnes stood in the center. She was small. She was trembling. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. This was the moment of nightmare. The monsters were real. They had faces. They had hands. The abstract threat of the courtroom had become the concrete reality of the lupanar. The order was given to strip her of her dignity. Rough hands moved to execute the sentence. In that moment, she stood exposed before their cruel gaze, a child surrounded by malice. She was humiliated before them, a child surrounded by cruelty and lust. They stared at her vulnerability. It was a violation without touch, a assaulted of the eyes. Shame washed over her, hot and stinging. She wished for the floor to open and swallow her whole, but there was nowhere to hide. The physical exposure was meant to signal her total loss of personhood. She was no longer Agnes. She was product. The men jeered. They made obscene comments. They bid on her like cattle. "Who is first?" someone shouted. "Let the prefect's son have the first taste," another laughed. The cruelty was casual. It was sport. They jostled for position, betting on who would break her first. Agnes closed her eyes. She shut out the faces. She shut out the jeers. She went inward. She found the quiet place in her soul where her vow lived. She spoke to her God. She did not ask for rescue. She did not ask for lightning to strike them down. She asked for coverage. She asked for a shield. "You are my husband," she prayed. "Do not let them defile what is yours." It was a prayer of ownership. She was asserting that she was already claimed property, and therefore could not be stolen by Rome. And then, according to the legend, the impossible happened. It was not a thunderclap. It was not an earthquake. It was a change in the air. The shadows in the corners of the room deepened. The light from the oil lamps seemed to bend. A strange heaviness settled over the men. They stopped laughing. They stopped moving. The lust in their eyes turned to confusion. The predatory atmosphere evaporated, replaced by an instinctual unease. Agnes felt a warmth. It started at her scalp. Her hair, golden and fine, began to move. It was not the wind. There was no wind in that stifling room. It grew, it lengthened, it flowed down her back, over her shoulders, past her waist. It cascaded like a waterfall of silk. It grew thick and lustrous. Within moments, her entire body was covered. The golden tresses wrapped around her like a cloak. She was no longer naked. She was clothed in her own glory. It was a phenomenon that defied natural law. What should have taken years happened in seconds. The men gasped. They stepped back. This was unnatural. This was divine. But the miracle did not stop there. A light began to emanate from her. It was soft at first, like the glow of a pearl. Then it grew brighter. It was white. It was intense. It was blinding. It did not come from a lamp. It came from her flesh. It pulsed with a terrible purity. It filled the dark, dirty room with a radiance that hurt the eyes. It was not a warm, inviting light. It was a cold, hard light of judgment. It cast no shadows because it came from every direction at once. The men shielded their faces, cowering before the light. They cowered. The darkness of the brothel could not exist with this light. Their lust evaporated, replaced by primal fear. This was not a girl. This was something else. This was power. They scrambled back, knocking over benches and wine jars. The instinct to dominate was replaced by the instinct to flee. Agnes opened her eyes. She saw them backing away. She saw the terror on their faces. The predators had become the prey. The light pushed them against the walls. They covered their eyes, screaming that they were blind. The captain of the guard drew his sword, but his hand shook so violently he dropped it. The clang of steel on stone echoed like a judgment bell. The weapon of the state lay useless on the floor. Agnes stood alone in the circle of light. She was untouched. She was calm. The shame was gone. The fear was gone. She realized the truth. They could strip her clothes, but they could not strip her grace. Her body was a temple, and God had filled the temple with his presence. No man could enter, but one man was foolish enough to try. The son of the prefect had arrived. He pushed through the cowering crowd. He was angry. He did not see the danger. He only saw the girl he wanted. He saw her covered in hair, glowing with light, and his pride blinded him. He thought it was a trick. He thought it was magic. He drew his dagger. He shouted curses. He lunged at her. He was driven by an arrogance so profound it overrode his survival instinct. He believed his desire was the supreme law of the universe. "You are mine," he screamed. He reached out to grab her. He wanted to tear the hair away. He wanted to extinguish the light. According to ancient accounts, there was no sound of impact. As he crossed the boundary into the light, he simply collapsed. His heart stopped instantly. The room went silent again. Death had entered. The men pressed themselves against the walls, terrified to breathe. The captain of the guard checked the boy. He looked up, his face pale. "He is dead," he whispered. Agnes stood over the body. She did not gloat. She did not smile. She looked at the boy with pity. He had died of his own darkness. He had touched holiness with unclean hands, and it had consumed him. She understood that he was a victim of his own entitlement, poisoned by the very system that raised him. The news spread fast. Soldiers ran to the prefect. "Your son is dead," they said. "The Christian witch killed him." Sempronius came running. He burst into the brothel. He saw his son lying on the dirty floor. He saw the girl glowing and covered in her hair. He fell to his knees. He wept. He howled. His grief was a wounded animal's cry. The mask of the politician was gone. Only the broken father remained. He looked at Agnes. His eyes were red with hate. "You murdered him," he screamed. "Sorceress! Witch! You used your dark magic." Agnes spoke. Her voice cut through his wailing. "I did not touch him," she said. "He was killed by his own intent. An angel of light defends this body. Your son tried to violate the temple of God. He paid the price." She spoke not with the voice of a defendant, but with the authority of a judge. Sempronius stood up. He drew his sword. He wanted to cut her down right there, but the light stopped him. He could not get close. He was powerless. He was the most powerful man in Rome, and he was defeated by a 12-year-old girl in a brothel. The steel of his blade was useless against the barrier of light. He changed his tactic. He pleaded. "If your God is real," he choked out, "bring him back. Prove it. If you are a saint, show mercy. Give me back my son." It was a trap. If she failed, she was a fraud. If she succeeded, she admitted to having power over life and death, which was sorcery in Roman law. A miracle would be proof of the crime of magic. But Agnes did not calculate. She did not play politics. She acted from the heart. She knelt. She placed her hands together. She prayed, not for herself, for her enemy. She chose compassion over strategy. The light around her softened. It focused on the boy. Agnes asked life to return to the vessel of death. She asked for a second chance for the one who wanted to destroy her. The boy's chest moved. A gasp of air rushed into his lungs. He coughed. He sat up. He looked around, bewildered. He looked at Agnes. He did not see a prize anymore. He saw a terror. He scrambled back, pushing himself across the floor away from her. The resurrection was not gentle. It was a violent re-entry into the world of the living. "She is holy," he screamed. "Do not touch her. The God of the Christians is real." Sempronius held his son. He was relieved, but he was also trapped. The crowd had seen the miracle. They had heard the boy's confession. This was dangerous. If the people believed in her God, the authority of Rome would crumble. The priests of the pagan temples began to shout. They were outside, drawn by the commotion. They recognized the threat immediately. A God that could raise the dead and protect virgins would make their own gods obsolete. "Sorcery!" they yelled. "She bewitched the boy. She is a danger to Rome. Kill the witch. Kill her." The mob mentality took over. Fear turned to anger. They did not want a miracle that challenged their worldview. They wanted blood. They needed to destroy the anomaly to restore their sense of order. Sempronius looked at Agnes. He owed her his son's life, but he was a politician first. He could not let a Christian girl triumph. He could not let the mob turn on him. He calculated the cost of mercy and found it too high. He made a decision. He would wash his hands of it. He left the brothel, dragging his son. He left Agnes to the mob. He left her to the deputy judge, a man named Aspasius. Aspasius was a bureaucrat. He saw a riot forming. He needed to end it. The situation in the stadium of Domitian was rapidly deteriorating. What had begun as a standard judicial proceeding against a dissident minor was transforming into a public spectacle that threatened the stability of the district. Aspasius was not a man of passion. He was a deputy judge, a functionary of the Roman state tasked with maintaining order. He looked at the girl. She was calm, too calm. It unnerved him. In his years of service, Aspasius had sentenced thieves, murderers, and traitors. He was accustomed to the sights and sounds of the condemned, the begging, the weeping, the violent thrashing against chains. Resistance was the norm. Fear was the currency of the court. But Agnes offered neither. She stood in the center of the chaos with a stillness that defied the gravity of her situation. This lack of reaction was not merely stubbornness. It felt like a dismissal of his authority. The mob outside the brothel was growing louder, their shouts a mixture of bloodlust and superstitious dread following the death of the prefect's son. Aspasius calculated his options. Imprisonment would only allow the rumors of her magic to spread. Exile would make her a martyr in absentia. He needed a definitive visual conclusion. He needed to erase her. He gave the order. "Burn her," he said. "Purify the witch with fire." The command was pragmatic. Fire was the traditional method for disposing of sorcerers and those deemed enemies of the gods. It was a cleansing agent, a way to obliterate the physical form so that nothing remained to be worshipped or revered. Soldiers moved in. They stayed out of the light's reach but used their spears to herd her. These were seasoned legionaries, men who had faced barbarian hordes on the frontiers. Yet they handled this unarmed child with a cautious distance. They pushed her out of the brothel. They pushed her into the public square. The stadium of Domitian, the site of modern-day Piazza Navona, was a vast arena designed for games and athletic contests. Now, it served as a theater of execution. A stake was driven into the ground. Wood was piled high. The execution was set. The logistics of death in Rome were efficient. The timber was dry, seasoned for quick ignition. Pitch and oil were poured over the logs to ensure the flames would rise fast and hot. The pyre was constructed not just to kill, but to consume. Agnes walked to the stake. She did not struggle. Most victims had to be dragged to the pyre, their heels digging into the dirt, their screams echoing off the stone arches. Agnes walked with a steady gait. She climbed the wood. She stood against the post. The soldiers tied her hands. They tied her feet. The ropes were rough hemp biting into her wrists, but she gave no sign of discomfort. The crowd roared. They wanted to see the flames consume the girl who had defied their lust. The mob mentality had taken over. They needed a scapegoat for the disruption of the day, a focal point for their collective anger and confusion. The torch was lit. The fire was thrown onto the wood. The square was a cauldron of noise. The mob screamed for blood. They screamed for order. They screamed to drown out the nagging voice in their own heads that whispered, "This is wrong." Deep down, the spectacle of a 12-year-old girl being burned alive unsettled even the most hardened Roman citizens. But the momentum of the event was unstoppable. Agnes stood at the stake. She was small against the vastness of the Roman sky. The wood was piled high around her feet. dry timber soaked in oil, ready to consume. The executioner stepped forward. He held a torch. The flame danced in the wind, hungry and orange. He looked at the girl. He waited for the crack in her armor. He expected the facade of bravery to crumble as the heat approached. Most prisoners at this moment would be wailing. They would be bargaining with their gods. They would be voiding their bowels in terror. The body has biological reactions to the proximity of death that the mind cannot control. Agnes did none of these things. She looked at the horizon. She looked past the buildings, past the hills of Rome. She was already gone. Her focus was fixed on a point beyond the visible world. He thrust the torch into the wood. The fire roared to life, sudden and violent. The oil caught instantly, sending a column of black smoke and bright orange flame shooting upward, wrapping around the stake to consume its victim. But tradition tells us they did not touch the girl. The laws of nature seemed to suspend. Instead of drawing inward to consume the fuel and the body, the fire was repelled. It was as if an invisible bubble surrounded her. The fire raged outward, snapping at the soldiers, scorching the eyebrows of those who stood too close. The heat was intense, uncontrolled, billowing toward the spectators and the guards, forcing them to retreat in panic. But around Agnes, the air was cool. The fire formed a circle, a wall of flame that protected her rather than destroyed her. She stood in the center of the inferno, untouched. Her hair still covered her like a golden cloak, unsinged. The smoke did not choke her. The heat did not blister her skin. She raised her hands. She was praying. The firelight illuminated her face, making her look not like a victim, but like a creature of pure spirit. The visual was striking and terrifying to the Roman mind. Fire was a force of nature, a tool of the gods. For it to refuse to burn a victim suggested that a power greater than Rome was at play. The crowd fell silent. The cheering died in their throats. This was the second miracle, first the brothel, now the pyre. Fear began to ripple through the square. The mob is a fickle beast. It turns from aggression to panic in a heartbeat. "She is a witch," someone screamed, but the voice cracked. "The gods protect her," another shouted. Confusion reigned. The narrative was slipping away from the authorities. If she walked out of the fire alive, the legend would be uncontrollable. Aspasius, the deputy judge, watched from his podium. His face went pale. He gripped the arms of his chair. This was a disaster. As a representative of the empire, his primary duty was to maintain the illusion of Roman control. If the fire would not kill her, the people would believe she was divine. The authority of Rome was being mocked by a child. A failed execution was viewed as a sign of weak leadership or divine disfavor. He could not let this happen. He could not let her survive. Order must be maintained. The law must be absolute. The state could not be seen to lose a contest of wills against a 12-year-old. He stood up. He pointed a shaking finger at the executioner. "The sword," he bellowed. "Use the sword. Finish it." The executioner was a large man, a veteran. He had killed hundreds of criminals. He knew the anatomy of death. He knew how to sever a spine, how to strangle, how to crush. But now he hesitated. He looked at the fire that refused to burn. He looked at the girl who prayed in the flames. He was afraid. He was witnessing something beyond his understanding. The superstitious dread that permeated Roman society gripped him. To strike someone protected by the gods was to invite a curse. But an order was an order. Disobedience meant his own death. In the Roman military hierarchy, failure to execute a command was a capital offense. He drew his gladius, the short Roman sword, sharp, heavy, efficient. It was a weapon designed for the close quarters combat of the legionary infantry. It was a stabbing weapon, meant for the thrust. He stepped through the heat. He approached the stake. The flames parted for him, or perhaps they had died down enough to allow passage. Agnes saw him coming. She stopped praying. She opened her eyes. She did not recoil. She did not flinch. She looked at the blade. It shone in the firelight. It was the instrument of her deliverance. She understood the mechanics of what was happening better than the men around her. The fire had been a sign, but the sword was the conclusion. She spoke to him. Her voice was clear, cutting through the crackle of the fire. "Why do you delay?" she asked. The executioner stopped. He stared at her. Victims did not speak like this. Victims begged. They offered bribes. They screamed for mercy. They tried to run. "Strike," she said. "This body draws eyes that I do not want. These eyes are heavy with sin. If my living flesh causes men to stumble, then let it be destroyed. I don't fear your sword. I welcome it. Strike." She knelt. It was a gesture of supreme grace. She pulled her hair aside. She exposed her neck. It was white, fragile. The pulse beat steadily beneath the skin. She offered her life. She did not wait for him to take it. She took control of her own death, kneeling to expose her neck. The executioner raised his sword, but his seasoned hands trembled. Unmanned by a child's courage, he realized a standard beheading was impossible for such a fragile frame. He shifted his grip for the fatal strike. He had to enter her space to deliver the blow. The blade found its mark. The strike was swift, and the world held its breath. Her voice was gone, and the world held its breath. The reality of the wound was immediate. The crowd watched as the light faded from her eyes. Agnes fell. She did not cry out. She slumped forward, her knees hitting the ashes. The force of life left her instantly. The fire died down, as if its purpose was done. Agnes lay on the ground. She fell to the earth. Her sacrifice was complete. The life left her instantly, leaving only a profound silence in its wake. She was dead. The little body was still. The chest did not rise. The eyes were closed. Silence. Absolute silence. The crowd stared. They had wanted this. They had screamed for it. But now that it was done, they felt a strange emptiness. They felt a weight. They looked at the small broken form. It looked so harmless. It looked so young. The adrenaline of the mob dissipated, leaving behind the cold reality of the act. Was this the enemy of Rome? Was this the threat to the empire? A dead child lying in the dirt? The mighty machinery of the state, the prefect, the judge, the soldiers, the executioner, had all mobilized to crush a single girl. They had succeeded, and in doing so, they had revealed their own moral bankruptcy. A woman in the crowd began to weep, then another. The mood shifted. The mob's rage evaporated, leaving only shame. They realized what they had done. They had murdered innocence. They had extinguished a light because it was too bright for their dark eyes. The spectacle had failed. Instead of reinforcing the power of the state, it had highlighted its cruelty. The soldiers moved in to clear the body. Why did they weep? Even these hardened men felt the wrongness of the act. Because war has logic. You kill the enemy to save yourself. But there is no logic in killing a child. It is an act against nature. When the soldiers saw Agnes fall, the illusion of Roman justice shattered. They were not defending the empire. They were butchers. The executioner washed the blood from his hands, returning to the mundane routine of Roman life. He had fulfilled his order, yet the empire he served had just suffered a defeat from which it would never truly recover. His action had condemned his own empire. He had killed the body of a child, but he had birthed a revolution. State violence ends at the grave, but Agnes's legacy was just beginning. But the Christians were already there. They came out of the shadows. They ignored the danger. They ignored the soldiers. Their love was greater than their fear. In the Roman persecutions, claiming the body of a martyr was a dangerous act. It identified the claimants as co-conspirators. Yet they gathered around Agnes. They lifted her gently. They treated her body like a relic. They dipped cloth in her blood. This was not morbid curiosity. This was an act of war. They were harvesting the evidence. Every drop of blood was a seed. These blood-soaked cloths, known as brandeia, would be preserved, hidden, and venerated. They were tangible proof of the victory of faith over death. They carried her away. The procession moved through the streets. No one stopped them. Even the soldiers stepped aside. There was a dignity in death that commanded respect. The authorities had no stomach for further violence that day. They let the Christians take their dead. Agnes was buried in a catacomb on the Via Nomentana. It was a simple grave, a hole in the rock, but it became a beacon. The death of Agnes was supposed to be a warning. It was supposed to terrify the Christians into submission. It was supposed to show the power of Rome. It did the opposite. News of her death spread like wildfire. It went from house to house. It went from city to city. It crossed the sea. People heard the story. The girl who defied the prefect, the girl who defeated the brothel, the girl who walked through fire, the girl who welcomed the sword. They heard about her courage. They heard about her purity. And they asked themselves a dangerous question. What kind of God gives a 12-year-old girl that kind of power? People began to visit her grave. At first it was a trickle, then a stream, then a river. They came to pray. They came to ask for her intercession. They felt a presence there, a peace, a strength. Among the visitors was a woman named Constantina. She was not just any woman. She was the daughter of the Emperor Constantine, the man who would one day change the world. But at that time, she was just a woman in pain. She suffered from a terrible disease. Her body was covered in sores. She was dying. She had tried every doctor, every medicine, every pagan god. Nothing worked. She heard about Agnes. She heard about the miracles. Desperation drove her to the catacombs. She went to the grave. She knelt in the dirt. She prayed to the little martyr. She fell asleep there, exhausted by her suffering. In her dream, Agnes appeared to her. She was not dead. She was not bloody. She was radiant. She was dressed in light, surrounded by a choir of virgins. She spoke to Constantina. She told her to have faith. She told her that Christ could heal her. Constantina woke up. The pain was gone. The sores were gone. Her skin was smooth. She was healed. This miracle changed everything. Constantina went to her father. She told him what happened. Constantine, the ruler of the Western Empire, listened. He saw his daughter's health. He saw the power of the Christian God. He ordered a basilica to be built over Agnes's grave, a great church, a monument to the girl Rome had tried to erase. The empire that killed her was now bowing to her. But the story of Agnes is not just about miracles and churches. It is about the victory of the human spirit. It is about the refusal to be defined by others. Her name is spoken every day in the canon of the Mass. Her feast day is celebrated every year. Artists painted her. Poets wrote about her. She became the patron saint of young girls, of survivors of violence, of the children of Mary. She stands as a reminder that power is not muscle, power is not gold, power is not an army. True power is knowing who you are. It is knowing to whom you belong. The catacombs where she was buried became a hive of activity. At night, figures moved through the dark tunnels. They carried lamps, they carried prayers, they gathered around the slab of rock that covered her bones. They touched the stone, they felt a connection. One night, a week after her death, a group of Christians gathered at the tomb. Among them was Emerentiana. She was Agnes's foster sister. They had grown up together. played together, shared secrets. Emerentiana was not yet baptized. She was a catechumen learning the faith, but her heart was already given. She stood by the grave. She wept. Her grief was raw. She missed her sister. She missed her friend. But as she prayed, a group of pagan thugs arrived. They had been watching the catacombs. They knew the Christians were gathering. They were looking for a fight. They were looking for victims. They saw the group praying. They saw Emerentiana. She was young, like Agnes. She was vulnerable. They jeered. They threw stones. "Worshippers of the dead," they shouted. "Followers of the witch." The other Christians scattered. They ran into the deeper tunnels. But Emerentiana did not run. She stood her ground. She turned to face the mob. She was filled with a sudden, fierce anger, not for herself, but for Agnes. "You monsters!" she screamed. "You killed her. You killed a saint, and now you disturb her rest. You are the dead ones. Your souls are dead." The thugs were stunned. A girl shouting back, it enraged them. They picked up larger stones. They advanced. The first rock hit her shoulder. She staggered but did not fall. The second hit her head. Blood ran down her face. The violence of Rome was feeding the fire it tried to quench. Years passed. The persecution continued. Diocletian abdicated. The tetrarchy crumbled. Civil wars tore the empire apart. Emperors rose and fell, but the cult of Agnes grew. It spread from the catacombs to the palaces. Then came Constantine, the battle of the Milvian Bridge, the vision of the cross in Hoc Signo Vinces. By this sign, you will conquer. Rome changed. The persecution stopped. Christianity was legalized. The story of Agnes came out of the dark. It was no longer whispered. It was shouted from the rooftops. It was preached in the basilicas. The little girl who died was now more famous than the generals who had killed her. But fame brings its own distortion. Legends began to attach themselves to her. Poets wrote flowery verses. They turned her into an ethereal being floating above the earth. They forgot the grit. They forgot the blood. They forgot the terrified child in the brothel. But behind the legend lay flesh and blood. She felt pain. She felt cold. She felt the crushing weight of loneliness. Her victory was not that she was superhuman. Her victory was that she was human, and yet she did not break. The church etched her name into the canon. Felicity, Perpetua, Agatha, Lucy, Agnes. A roll call of women who refused to break. But the men? The prefect? The judge? History swallowed them whole. They believed they were the authors of this era, but they were merely the villains in her story, shadows casting the light into sharper relief. Sempronius is a footnote. Aspasius is a shadow. We only know them because they crossed her path. They thought they were the main characters. They believed they were the authors of history. Today they are remembered only as the men who murdered a child. They were the darkness that made her light shine brighter. It is a strange irony. The Roman Empire was obsessed with legacy. They built monuments of stone. They carved their names into marble. They wanted to be eternal. But stone erodes, marble cracks, names are forgotten. Agnes built nothing. She wrote nothing. She commanded no armies. She simply stood firm, and she is remembered. Because true legacy is not what you build. It is what you inspire. Every year on the 21st of January, this victory is reenacted. It is a ritual that dates back centuries. It happens in Rome at the basilica built over her bones. It is strange. It is primitive. It is powerful. 2 living lambs are brought into the church. They are small. They are pristine white. They are decorated with flowers. One wears a crown of white flowers for purity. The other wears a crown of red flowers for martyrdom. They are carried down the aisle. The incense smokes. The chant rises. These animals are not there to be pets. They are there to become relics. They are blessed. They are taken away. They are cared for by nuns until Holy Week. Then they are shorn. Their wool is cut. This wool is not used for sweaters. It is not sold in the market. It is woven into a specific garment, a narrow band of white cloth marked with 6 black crosses. It is called the pallium. The pallium is the symbol of the Pope's authority. It is placed around his shoulders. It is the yoke of Christ, but it is made from the wool of Agnes's lambs. The Pope is the most powerful figure in the Catholic Church. He commands 1 billion souls. He speaks to presidents. He holds the keys to the kingdom, but around his neck he wears the symbol of a 12-year-old girl. He does not wear gold. He does not wear iron. He wears the wool of the martyr. It signifies that his power does not come from strength. It comes from service. It comes from the willingness to be the victim. Every time the Pope puts on the pallium, he is submitting to the memory of Agnes. The old man bows to the young girl. The hierarchy bows to the child. This is the subversion of Rome. The empire believed power was taking. Agnes proved power is giving. But her legacy is not just in papal vestments. It is in the dirt and the blood of daily life. For centuries, Agnes has been the patron saint of violated survivors. She is the patron of girls threatened by the lust of men. This is not a polite title. It is a desperate one. The world is a violent place. The dynamic that killed Agnes, the powerful preying on the weak, did not end in 304 AD. It happens today. It happens in war zones. It happens in dark alleys. It happens in bedrooms. Agnes stands in that gap. She offers a different narrative to the victim. The world tells the victim, you are damaged, you are dirty, you are shameful. The world tells the victim that because their body was violated, their soul is broken. Agnes says, no. She faced the brothel. She faced the threat of total violation. And she walked out untouched, not just physically, but spiritually. Her message is radical. The body can be attacked, but the integrity of the self is inviolable. You are not what happens to you. You are who you choose to be. In the Middle Ages, women carried medals of St. Agnes. They were not just jewelry. They were shields. They were psychological armor. In a time when women had zero rights, when they were property of fathers and husbands, Agnes was a reminder of autonomy. She was a radical figure of faith. She did not preach a political revolution. She sparked a revolution of the spirit. She challenged the ancient assumption that a woman's value lies in her availability. Renaissance painters softened her, depicting her with sweet, watery eyes. But the Byzantine mosaics tell a different story. In those ancient stones, she stands stiff, her eyes wide and dark, holding a cross like a weapon. There is no fear in her face. There is no softness. There is only steel. This is the real Agnes, the Agnes of the brothel, the Agnes of the pyre. She is not a doll. She is a warrior. Her story holds a mirror to our own society. We believe we are more civilized than the Romans, yet the dynamic remains unchanged. We still commodify youth. We still turn children into objects to be consumed. The Circus Agonalis has simply moved from stone arches to digital screens. Agnes stands as a silent judge against this compliance. Why do we click? Why does society tolerate the consumption of the young? The Romans killed her because she was a mirror that reflected their own filth. They smashed the mirror, but the reflection remains. This is the final paradox. The weak survive. The strong perish. If you go to the Piazza Navona today, you are standing on the site of the ancient brothel. It is a place of noise, tourists, painters, musicians. But underneath the pavement, the foundations are the same. And in the church of Sant'Agnese in Agone, the skull of the saint is kept. It is not a metaphor. It is a harsh reality. The skull is small, fragile. It is unmistakably the head of a child. When you look at it, you are forced to strip away the legend. You are forced to confront the absolute reality of what happened. A 12-year-old girl stood alone against the machinery of the world. She did not have a lawyer. She did not have a weapon. She did not have a rescue team. She had a choice: compliance or death. Most of us choose compliance. We compromise. We sell small pieces of our soul to stay safe. We sell our silence to keep our jobs. We sell our dignity to be liked. We rationalize it. We say it is necessary. We say we have no choice. Agnes proves us wrong. She proves that the human will is sovereign. No one can take your integrity unless you give it to them. The executioner could cut her throat, but he could not make her bow. She is a mirror. When we look at her, we see our own cowardice. We see the times we said yes to the world when we should have screamed no, but she also offers hope. The story of Agnes is not a tragedy about a dead child. It is a manifesto of freedom. It tells us that freedom does not come from the state. It comes from within. It comes from knowing who you are and to whom you belong. Agnes knew she belonged to God. That ownership gave her immunity. It made her untouchable. You do not need to be a giant to defeat a monster. You just need to be pure, and you need to be willing to bleed for it. Agnes of Rome, 12 years old, virgin, martyr, conqueror. The lives of the saints are not merely history. They are a spiritual inheritance gifted to us all. Agnes is but one star in a vast constellation of faith. Which saint has touched your life? Whose story of holiness should we honor in our next video? Please share their name in the comments to guide our journey.